It started like it always does with pressure. The United States, once again, turned up the heat on Canada. Threats to walk away from the USMCA. New tariffs floated on key Canadian exports. A handful of diplomatic digs aimed at tightening Washington's grip on the regional trade order. To most, it looked like business as usual, the U.S. flexing its economic weight to get what it wanted from its quieter northern neighbor. But what happened next didn't go according to plan. Instead of folding, Canada recalibrated. Instead of backing down, Canada accelerated. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. The pressure campaign meant to bring Canada in line did something very different. It pushed the country to stand on its own. And that shift, it's now reshaping the balance of power in North America. At first, the strategy seemed clear. By threatening to withdraw from USMCA and launching tariff salvos, the U.S. was trying to steer Canada's economic behavior, slow its independent policies, tighten control over its supply chains, and keep investment flowing south. But the assumptions behind that strategy misjudged one crucial factor. Canada wasn't in the same position it was 10 years ago. The world had changed, and Canada was ready. Instead of reacting with fear or compliance, Canada started diversifying. Fast. Trade talks intensified with Europe. Engagement with Asian markets deepened. Within months, Canadian foreign direct investment spiked by $78 billion to a total of $1.5 trillion. The same pressure that was supposed to box Canada and ended up launching it outward. Not only did the country find new partners, it became more attractive to investors looking for a safe bet. Because here's what matters. When the U.S. started rattling its sabers, global companies took notice. And a lot of them didn't like what they saw. Tariff threats, policy swings, political dysfunction. For multinational firms trying to plan long-term supply strategies, the U.S. looked increasingly volatile. Canada, on the other hand, started to look like the safer option. A country with stable rules, global trade agreements, and most importantly clear direction. So when American economic pressure intensified, Canada didn't shrink. It built. Reinvestment poured into Canadian manufacturing. Nearshoring became more than just a buzzword, it became a blueprint. Domestic production scaled up across key industries, from electric vehicles to critical minerals. Sectors that once leaned heavily on American integration began building their own internal lifelines. And supply chains? They started shifting not away from North America, but within it, toward the north. And in that climate of uncertainty, foreign firms started looking around and landing in Canada. European and Asian companies, once defaulting to U.S. partnerships, began treating Canada as the entry point to North American markets. Why? Because it offered access without the instability. The trade agreements were already in place. The regulatory framework was transparent. And most importantly, there wasn't a new crisis every quarter. What started as an effort to pressure Canada had turned into a massive miscalculation. By the end of 2025, Canada wasn't just recovering, it was redefining its industrial landscape. EV battery plants, critical mineral processing, clean energy component manufacturing. What were once strategic weaknesses were turning into competitive advantages. And international capital was responding. The shift wasn't just defensive, it was deliberate. Canada didn't just weather the pressure, it used it as fuel. Diversifying its trade portfolio wasn't just a way to reduce risk. It became a long-term play to expand influence. Agreements with India, TIs with Europe, outreach to South America. While the U.S. was pulling inward, Canada was building outward. And that change, quiet, steady, calculated, started drawing attention from the very people who once saw Canada as dependent. Because the truth was out, the U.S. approach had backfired. Instead of constraining Canada's options, it had forced them to grow. Instead of consolidating North American leadership, it had opened the door to competition. And for the first time in decades, the question wasn't how much does Canada rely on the U.S., it was how much longer can the U.S. afford to take Canada for granted. Critical minerals, electric vehicle components, Clean tech supply chains. These are not secondary markets, they are the future of industrial competition. And Canada's foothold in them is growing. Not because it's moving faster than the US, but because it's moving more decisively. Meanwhile, American volatility is eating into its own leverage. The assumption that economic might could dictate regional behavior is breaking down. Because economic power isn't just about size, it's about trust, stability, reliability. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next. And you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. And right now, many companies are looking north because they can no longer plan south. This doesn't mean Canada is replacing the US on the global stage. But in North America, it's stepping into a role that Washington used to play without question. A manufacturing hub, a safe harbor for capital, a diplomatic counterweight. And it's not because Canada fought for that status, it's because US policy pushed them there. This is the paradox at the heart of pressure politics. You can't push without knowing what you're pushing against. In this case, US policymakers underestimated the depth of Canada's resilience, the breadth of its trade strategy, and the appeal of its long-term stability. They didn't expect resistance to become reinvention, but that's exactly what happened. Let us know what part of this economic shift caught you by surprise. Drop a comment below if you've been tracking these changes, or if this is the first time you're seeing just how deep the transformation goes. Like, if you think more people need to hear this, and subscribe, to stay locked into the stories reshaping the world, behind the headlines. For decades, Canada was seen as the reliable junior partner in North America. Quiet, cooperative, economically tied at the hip to the United States. The assumption was baked into everything from trade deals to policy summits to investment forecasts. Canada could be counted on to follow the US lead, because frankly, it didn't have much of a choice. But now, that entire premise is being rewritten. And it didn't take a war, a revolution, or a global collapse. All it took was pressure, miscalculated, short-sighted, and aggressively applied US pressure. The threat to pull out of USMCA wasn't just a bluff, it was a signal. One that hit Canadian boardrooms, parliament, and industrial sectors like a cold slap across the face. If the US was willing to throw a major continental trade agreement into question just to win a policy argument, what else could be on the chopping block? So Canada started asking the question it hadn't seriously asked in years. What if we couldn't rely on the US anymore? That question turned into action. And that action turned into transformation. Let's talk numbers. Foreign direct investment into Canada jumped $78 billion, bringing the total to a staggering $1.5 trillion. That's not a small country making a few new friends, that's a full pivot in global capital flows. And the shift wasn't just opportunistic, it was strategic. European and Asian investors weren't just hedging their bets, they were rethinking where they wanted to build, innovate, and expand. And increasingly, the answer wasn't Texas or Ohio, it was Ontario, Quebec, Alberta. Not because Canada was louder or flashier, but because it was stable, predictable, and in a geopolitical climate that felt increasingly unstable, that became a competitive advantage. But this isn't just about perception, it's about production. Critical minerals, electric vehicle parts, batteries, these aren't side projects. They are the heart of 21st century industrial policy. And Canada, under pressure, decided to build those sectors out fast. With clean energy targets rising and global powers racing to secure rare earths and clean tech capacity, Canada stepped in and filled a vacuum. That's the irony here. The US tried to box Canada in, and in doing so, force Canada to build the very industries that now make it a direct competitor for regional influence. The optics couldn't have been worse. While the US appeared inward-looking and reactive, Canada was playing the long game, quietly laying the groundwork for economic self-reliance, energy independence, and global integration. And the more that US policy fluctuated, the clearer the contrast became. One country appeared locked in a cycle of political volatility, trade aggression, and policy reversals. The other was signing new trade agreements, stabilizing its currency, attracting global investment, and expanding its domestic manufacturing base. The narrative flipped. Canada wasn't just surviving US pressure, it was using it. That's the part that changes everything. Because the moment a smaller power can take a punch, get back up, and turn it into fuel, that's when the balance starts to shift. You could see it in the auto sector. When the US pushed for EV tax incentives that disadvantaged foreign manufacturers, Canada doubled down on attracting EV investment. And it worked. Battery plants, auto assembly lines, and component manufacturers began opening shop north of the border, not as a plan B, but as a primary hub. You could see it in mining, with China dominating global critical mineral supply and the US scrambling for alternatives. Canada positioned itself as the Western world's responsible, transparent, and resource-rich option. Global players took notice, and you could see it in supply chains. As companies sought to nearshore operations post-COVID, the US was the natural choice until tariffs, regulations, and economic uncertainty made Canada the better bet. This didn't happen because Canada picked a fight. It happened because the US couldn't stop throwing elbows. And it's not just about who builds what. It's about where the power lies in shaping the future. For the first time in recent memory, serious conversations are happening about Canada's regional leadership potential, not as a sidekick, but as a true economic counterweight, and not in theory and real measurable ways. Supply chain hubs, energy exports, high-tech manufacturing, clean resource development. These aren't isolated wins, they're building blocks of a new strategic role, and Canada is quietly putting them together. What started as an effort to extract compliance from a smaller neighbor has, instead, led to a chain reaction that could diminish US leverage across the entire region. And the more the US doubles down on trade threats, the more it reinforces the very shift it's trying to prevent. Because this isn't just a Canada story, it's a global reaction to American unpredictability. The more the US leans into policy volatility, the more attractive alternative partners become. And right now, Canada isn't just one of those alternatives, it's becoming the go-to. That should be a wake-up call, but so far isn't. There's a dangerous assumption in US strategy that because the American market is large, companies will just deal with the chaos. That pressure equals power, that allies will always fall in line. But that assumption is eroding, and Canada is proof. You push hard enough, long enough, and eventually people stop listening. They start building their way out. That's what Canada has done. And now, it's not just recovering from pressure, it's rising because of it. So the next time the US threatens to tear up a trade agreement or weaponize tariffs to make a point, it might want to pause. Because the game has changed. Canada isn't just along for the ride anymore. It's driving its own agenda. And increasingly, others are getting on board. The power dynamic in North America isn't just shifting, it's already mid-shift. And whether or not Washington wants to acknowledge it, the numbers don't lie. For decades, the US counted on size alone to hold regional dominance. Its economy, its military, its cultural exports, it all created a gravitational pull that made countries like Canada operate in its orbit. But now, thanks to its own strategic missteps, the US is watching that gravitational center slip. Because what we're seeing with Canada isn't just a reaction, it's a pivot. And at the heart of that pivot is a question Canada hadn't asked seriously in generations. What if we stop waiting for the US to lead, and just lead ourselves? That's what's unfolding. You've got the US rattling trade agreements, throwing tariffs around like they don't come with consequences, and threatening to walk away from hard-won continental frameworks. But instead of panicking, Canada went to work. The country started tightening ties with Europe, signing deals in Asia, positioning itself as the low-risk gateway to the North American market. And it worked because while the US was busy playing economic hardball, Canada was making itself indispensable. Companies looking to hedge against political whiplash started parking their investments in Canada, not out of charity, not out of ideology, but because it made business sense. Stable regulations, transparent trade policy, a government that doesn't rewrite economic rules every time a headline breaks. For global investors trying to build long-term infrastructure in manufacturing, clean energy, tech, and transportation, that stability became gold. And while the U.S. was cycling through tariff disputes, labor unrest, and legal battles over trade enforcement, Canada was stacking strategic wins. Let's talk about nearshoring. One of the biggest global trends in supply chain restructuring, especially post-pandemic, has been the move to bring production closer to home. The U.S. had a real chance to capitalize on that. Instead, it opened the door for Canada to become the preferred choice. With a skilled workforce, modern infrastructure, and access to global trade through dozens of agreements, Canada positioned itself as the practical and politically safer option. This wasn't just about replacing factories, it was about replacing systems. And in sector after sector, Canada started building its own electric vehicle supply chains. Canada's locking them in. Critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Canada's developing them domestically and responsibly without the ethical baggage that comes with global mining giants. Battery production? Already underway, with major players signing on. And this isn't theoretical. The deals are signed. The facilities are being built. Foreign direct investment is flowing, not flowing into these projects. At the same time, the U.S. manufacturing sector, the one expected to rebound post-COVID, entered its longest contraction since 2008. 9 months straight. Consumer confidence dipped. Retail stuttered. And legal fights over tariff mismanagement started stacking up. Instead of rallying the region around a shared industrial strategy, the U.S. pulled back. It demanded more, gave less, and assumed countries would simply fall in line. But Canada didn't. Because here's the thing, pressure only works when the other side needs you more than you need them. And what we're seeing now is that Canada doesn't need the U.S. the way it used to. Sure, the economic ties are still deep. The U.S. is still Canada's largest trading partner. But the dependency has been broken. The assumption that American access is the only path to prosperity? That's dead. And Washington is still acting like it hasn't noticed. But the rest of the world has. Europe sees Canada as a backdoor into a continent where U.S. instability has made direct entry risky. Asian firms, frustrated by U.S. tariffs and sudden regulatory swings, are signing Canadian deals. Global capital is treating Canada not as a backup plan, but as Plan A. That's the shift. The very pressure campaign meant to assert American dominance has triggered the conditions for Canada to grow its own. And now, it's happening at a pace that even surprised seasoned analysts. Because there's no going back. Canada has diversified. It's reinvested. It's built out domestic capacity. And more importantly, it's changed the way it sees its role on the continent. The old Canada, cautious, deferential, quietly supportive, is gone. In its place, a country that's competing for influence, resources, and investment, and winning. This isn't a hostile takeover. It's a rebalancing. The U.S. can still lead, but only if it recognizes that the room looks different now. Canada isn't sitting quietly at the end of the table anymore. It's negotiating on its own terms. It's setting regional priorities. And it's proving that size isn't the only measure of power. So, when the next round of tariff threats inevitably comes, and it might be worth asking, are we still in a position to make that demand? Because Canada won't be caught flat-footed. Not this time. Drop a comment below. Were you expecting this kind of shift? Did the US overplay its hand? Let us know what you think. Like if you're tracking the quiet power moves happening around North America, and hit subscribe for more stories that expose what's really going on behind the headlines.